accompanying our course, Launching New Ventures, which is a free online course on entrepreneurship strategy and strategy for tech-driven startups that's available on Coursera. We're now in the 4th week of our course, so we have one more week left, and we're really glad to welcome some awesome panelists with us today to talk about their practical experiences with raising and managing money. So I'm very glad to welcome Rachel Cook, an entrepreneur who's joining us. Flynn? Hi, Rachel.
Hey.
So Rachel is the founder of Seeds, which converts freemium gamers into paying players through in-game microloan purchases. She has a really interesting background, formerly working in finance and in documentary filmmaking. And her filmmaking team included Emmy and Grammy nominees. So we have a lot of rich experiences to be listening to from Rachel coming soon. And then we also have William McQuillan, who's joining us from London, right, Will?
Yeah, in London. Hi, Natra, how are you?
Thanks so much for joining us, Will. Will is a partner at Frontline Ventures. He was a co-founder and CEO of Osmoda.com, an online sales platform targeting some of Europe's top emerging fashion brands before switching into the other side of the table, as we call it. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Raz-Friedman, who's joining us from Shenzhen. Jonathan is the founder and CEO of Kano. Hey, Jonathan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
What time is it over there? It looks dark.
It's 10:30 p.m. Shenzhen time.
Wow, great. So this is really an international panel. I wonder if we have any viewers watching this from, while wearing their pajamas. So Jonathan is the founder and CEO of Kano, a computer that anyone can build. Kano raised over $1.5 million through its Kickstarter campaign last year, passing their goal of $100,000. They recently announced a Series A funding of $15 million this year, including $500,000 that are open to community backers on an equity crowdfunding platform called Choir. So we have really a vast range of experiences to talk about here today, all of the many different ways of raising money for your startup and for your idea. So what's going to happen in the next hour is we're going to field some questions to our expert panelists. They're going to answer them, and these questions have been submitted to me via our Coursera platform and via our Facebook group and our Twitter feeds. So if you're listening right now, feel free to use the hashtag LNV15. So that's short for Launching New Ventures. And we'll be sure to include them later on in the hour if we have time. So I'm going to start off with a general question. We're talking about raising and managing money for your venture. So my question here is something that I heard a lot while traveling to interview entrepreneurs for our course, where we featured entrepreneurs from sub-Saharan Africa and around Europe. And something that they say is, I don't have enough money to be an entrepreneur. So I was wondering, when is this true in your eyes? How did you guys get started? I wonder who wants to take this. Rachel, would you like to start on how you got started? Was this a question, is this a statement that you had in your mind? I don't have enough money to be an entrepreneur?
In my case, I just kind of dove in, and I would highly advise taking that route. If you have an idea and you think it can work, you're going to just need to take the leap at some points, and there are going to be a million hurdles that get in your way, and lack of funding is one of those. So for me, it was kind of like making the decision to launch the company, which didn't feel it wasn't like a huge leap at the beginning. It was just like I had this idea that I thought would work, and I was excited about it, but I needed to survive at the same time. So it's funny, I think, how once you kind of set something in motion, that opportunities present themselves to help you succeed that you might not have been able to foresee. So I actually came across a blog post, I remember, Mark Schuster's blog, Both Sides of the Table. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Mark Schuster, he was, I think, a two-time entrepreneur, and then he later became a VC. And he has this blog, and I still read it regularly. But I think this is in like maybe April of 2012, something like that. He posted about another founder that he knew, this woman, Tracy, I think her last name was D'Annunzio, and she had actually bootstrapped her startup using Airbnb. So she would sleep on the couch in her apartment and Airbnb out her room, and I think she brought in like $28,000 in a year, and that allowed her to survive while working on her startup full time. So I just came across this piece of information and thought, like, hey, I could do this with my apartment in New York as well. And that was one way that I kind of found enough funding to be able to focus on the startup full time while making sure that I could pay my rent and buy food and so forth. So yeah, there's always going to be a way to find what you need if you just kind of start keeping an eye out for more information and asking around about resources that might be available.
Thanks, Rachel. So let's give our viewers a bit more of a background. You've been working on your startup for how many years?
So we didn't officially incorporate until February of 2013, but the idea existed in some form since I believe I think it was like the middle of 2011. So it's been something like 4 years. We've pivoted a couple times, and there were years of just trying to survive at the beginning. Yeah, it's coming together, and the kind of it's just funny how much you learn when you launch a startup. Some of the things that I understand now would have seemed completely inaccessible to me a couple years ago. So again, I think this supports the idea that just taking the leap and diving in it's really, I think it's requisite. Don't feel as though you need to over prepare. Just kind of do it, and you'll have to learn things as you're going. And that's kind of the best way to do it, I think, sometimes.
That's super inspiring. So I just want to make sure people are following. I know that you've been working in finance for some time, and you also dabbled in some creative projects. So you did have some money saved before you found this opportunity to match microfinance organizations with gaming platforms. So what your startup enables people who create online or computer games to do is to allow them to make purchases that are then directly transformed into microfinance loans in the developing world. And so it sounds like you had this great idea, you had some money saved, and you went into it. You just threw yourself into it, and now you're working on bootstrapping your way to as your venture starts to build traction.
I didn't have any money saved by the time I launched Seeds because I'd sunk the savings that I did have into my previous documentary project. But I did bootstrap for a while, and then as I was going along and we started to gain more traction, I was able to raise a seed round of around $600,000. But it was because I kind of set things in motion that fundraising became more doable along the line.
Thanks, Rachel. Let's switch over to Jonathan. So Jonathan, can you explain to me the concept behind Kano, when you got it, and how you got started?
Yeah, well, there's the long story and the short story. I think I'll take the short story just for the sake of our global listeners. And the short story is basically three people, myself and my two co-founders, coming together around the concept of making technology accessible as a form of creation to anyone in the world, regardless of age, location, and knowledge. And we basically started with that notion, and then we gave a piece of hardware to a 6-year-old who happened to be the son of one of my co-founders. And he told us that he would love to build his own computer, but he wants to do it with no one teaches him how to do it. So it needs to be simple and fun, like Lego. And with that kind of a challenge, we went forward and developed a kind of a prototype, an alpha version, out of an apartment in London. And after 4 months, we launched a prototype, and we kind of launched it on a website, 200 units that we've basically made ourselves in a flat. One of the corners of the living room was a warehouse where we stored the components. Another corner of the living room were the place where we had a dispatch printer for shipping the product with Royal Mail, and we were assembling ourselves the kit and basically timing how long it would take us to assemble a kit, which was pretty fun. It took us way too long, of course, and we've made some improvements since then. And then following that initial success, following that initial process, we started to do workshops where we kind of really gauge the interest from kids and young people around what we're building. And the first workshop we've done, basically the first interaction we had with our prototype, we ran a workshop with 20 kids at the age of 9 in a primary school in London. And at the end of the workshop, one of the kids named Khalid, a 9-year-old, stood up and said that adults treat them like they're incapable because they're young, but today they've made a computer, so they're like super children. And for us, that was a huge kind of vote of confidence, which led us to raise a bit of money, move into an office, hire our first employee, and then for the next few months, we kind of prepared to our, as you mentioned, our successful Kickstarter campaigns. But that was basically the first 6 to 9 months of the company's life. With me relocating my life from Tel Aviv to London, with my other co-founder Alex finishing his master's degree in Cambridge, and the other co-founder Saul basically doing his own job of a day-to-day VC and a family person. And in between all that, we've managed to get to where we were after 6 months.
That's really interesting. So I really love the idea of you making these things in your apartment. And I also think what's interesting in your case, Jonathan, you had a lot of industry experience before deciding to be an entrepreneur. So it seems like we have two examples here of entrepreneurs who actually did different things before deciding they wanted to launch this adventure, rather than one of the myths today, or not myths, but most popular stories of individuals who drop out of school. It seems like this was something that you both thought about and were deeply committed to.
Well, there's the misconceptions of majority of entrepreneurs drop from high school or university. There are a few, definitely. The most renowned ones, and we know who they are. My recommendation from my personal experience, and I cannot speak for anyone else, what worked really well for me was, I graduated from an entrepreneurship program in university where during my university year, my last year, I basically worked on a first venture, which was called FunKit. And we developed kind of custom stickers to sneakers that kids can design themselves, and we would mass manufacture. And once we finished that year, I realized two things. One, I don't want to sell stickers, which was the obvious thing. The other one was, which I have no idea how to run a business, and I needed to learn. And the answer for me was not necessarily an MBA. I wanted to learn from someone, so I joined a multinational global manufacturing company where I had the privilege and luck to work with the president of the company for 3 years and really learn a lot about mass manufacturing, industrial design, and commercializing new products. And while I've been there, I knew eventually I'm going to start another company or try to start a successful company. So it was clear to me, but I was obviously waiting for the right opportunity, the right people, and the right timing. And it's never in front of you bluntly. You just need to sometimes just take the plunge. Just like Ronald Cohen says in his book, Second Bounce of the Ball. You can't learn to swim by exercising at the beach.
That's wonderful. It reminds me of these wonderful old-fashioned photographs of women who were tied around the waist with a rope and taught how to swim. I guess that was the old way of doing things, and now we're just jumping straight into the water.
Yeah. And I would echo that across our portfolio. On the first point, we do you have enough money to start a company? It's usually people who have been at some point in their life. Maybe they're in college, but mostly they're people who've worked for a number of years, and they've seen a problem that they think that they can solve and that they think should be solved, and they're passionate enough about it so that they're willing to actually take the risk, both financially and personally, to go and start their own company. And so it's rarely about do they have enough money to start. It's more about are they passionate and driven enough about what they want to do, because it's always going to be difficult, even if you have a bit of money at the beginning saved or not. It's being an entrepreneur, and I'm sure both the guys will back me up on this statement, is you're constantly putting out fires, you're constantly problem solving, and there's always challenges, it's ups and downs on a daily basis, and you need to be really passionate about the idea. So we see that across the founders in our portfolio. They are people who have sometimes quit jobs and taken huge financial risk. I know one of our companies, for I think the first year and a half, they were in their parents' house using one of the rooms until they got to almost 10 people, and then I think their parents were like, you need to move this office somewhere else. But there are ways around the money, but it's more about you finding something that you're really passionate about and that you're really willing to work hard and love doing.
Thanks, Will. I think that gives us really important perspective. so waiting for this right moment, waiting to find that opportunity, and at the same time continually investing in yourself, whether it is gaining new experiences or taking courses, but really just waiting for this opportunity that you'll be passionate about. I also wanted to bring something up because I think we have 40% of our students in this course are from emerging markets, and maybe that can be a little bit different. Maybe people will look from emerging markets to developed economies and say, well, you know, they clearly have enough money to launch a startup. So um, from what I've seen, it appears that entrepreneurs everywhere face the same challenges, even though some may be more extreme than others. And you really just need to have enough money to get started. It doesn't have to be a lot. I mean, everyone has social networks or families, parents, hopefully, where they can work from their where they can find a room to work out of. So that was a really important perspective. Will, do you want to give us an overview of the target funding amounts that Frontline envisions? I want to help the viewers situate our entrepreneurs where they might be in their funding journey, from seed funding to maybe Series A funding or beyond.
So just to make sure I understood the question, you're asking how much do people raise at different points, or what they need to have to raise a certain amount? Which were you?
I'm asking what are the target amounts that an entrepreneur might choose to raise from the beginning of their entrepreneurial journey to the end, and where Frontline likes to position themselves.
Sure. So we're an early stage investor. What that basically means is we can invest as little as 100,000, as much as 2 million, and really we invest at the earliest stages of a company. We're usually one of the first investors, if not the first investor in a company. What that often means is that it could be an idea on a piece of paper. They often usually don't even have their product built yet. It's just a prototype, and so we tend to invest very, very early. So that's where we invest. I guess for your listeners, trying to understand how much you should raise at the beginning is really a question for each individual person to ask themselves. I think really what they need to do is, first of all, they need to decide, where will this money bring me to? If it brings them to profitability, that's fantastic. If it brings them, then they won't ever need to think about raising again, and that's the amount they should raise. But usually, for a company to get to profitability, it needs to raise quite a lot of money. And so they raise it in series or different chunks. So that could be a seed round, a Series A round. So then if you take kind of the first round of funding, if you're thinking about how much you should raise, really what you should think about is, what is the milestone it's going to get me to allow me to raise that next round to eventually hopefully get to that profitability point. And so that could be a milestone. So that might be, in Jonathan's case, a successful Kickstarter campaign, or it could be assembling a great team, or it could be having a prototype, or it could be getting to a certain amount of revenue. And it really differs per person. But I think the key thing that the people listening need to do is consider two things. First of all, what milestone is this raise going to get me to? And secondly, they want to raise at least an amount that will last them 12 months. And the reason why I say that is because it really does take quite a bit of time to raise money, and I'm sure both Jonathan and Rachel will back that up, is that it always takes longer than you think. It's always, there's a lot of back and forth, and it takes a huge amount of time from the company. So it's not something you want to be doing that often. So the first thing is, I'd say, raise enough to get to a good milestone. And the second thing is, I'd say, you want to get a minimum capital amount that'll last you 12 months. And however much that amount is, it differs per company depending on what they need to do. But that would be my advice to the listeners.
Thanks, Will. That's really helpful. Rachel, do you want to comment on that, if that's been true for you? What kind of time horizon did you look at when you were raising your seed funding?
I mean, in my case, which may be somewhat unusual, I didn't feel that I had the luxury when I was just kind of trying to hustle and get by to, or I at least wasn't successfully able to raise enough to get us 12 months of runway, although that would have been great. So it was more of sort of a bootstrap mentality, as we've already talked about. So we started generating revenue and focusing on generating revenue earlier, and were able to bring in a little bit, and that helped us get by. And then there are other things that I did as well, in that in my past life, as touched on, I was in finance. I was a futures and equities trader, and I actually I was paying attention to Bitcoin in like the middle of 2013, and I saw that the prices had dipped low after Silk Road was shut down, and the U.S. federal government had seized a large amount of Bitcoin. And so the stock trader in me kind of just process that information and saw an opportunity to maybe make some money on a Bitcoin trade. And I ended up putting in as much as I could afford at the time and buying as much Bitcoin as I could afford. And I wrote out that trade and was able to make about 8 times my money in like a 3-month period. So I just share that. And then I use that money to pay my employees and continue bootstrapping the company.
Good work.
Thanks. I mean, it ended up being a great trade, and I timed it pretty well. But I mean, the opportunities like that that was sort of a unique opportunity. But I just bring this up because it dovetailed with a skill set that I already had. I knew how to make money trading different types of products, right? So I saw this opportunity and I made some money on it, and that helped me to survive. So yeah, I mean, because it didn't seem like I was going to be able to attract a VC, at least in that stage of the company's life, I was kind of looking for other ways to make sure that we could keep the company going.
That's super inspiring and actually much more glamorous than the stories I've heard of Airbnb founders selling cereal. So they were also, the opportunity they spotted was during the presidential campaigns, and so they created a cereal called Obama O's, which then sold out. So
Don't
that's
forget
a really
the McCain Crunch ones as well.
Oh yes, and those as well, of course, with amazing illustrations.
Yeah.
So this is just yet another story that I find really inspiring.
Thanks.
Jonathan, do you want to talk about where you're at in your funding journey? So you started out raising some seed funding, and then you had enormous success with your Kickstarter campaign, and recently just announced a new Series A funding round. And so some of the people who have backed you are VCs such as Index Ventures, Collaborative Fund, and Jim Breyer from Breyer Capital. Where do you see, how long do you imagine this money then lasting, and where do you look, how do you project your fundraising efforts in the future?
Yeah, well, that's obviously a challenging question to ask. You know, we were definitely lucky from the beginning to have several great angels investors supporting the company before the days of before the Kickstarter, which, you know, obviously supported us in creating a successful Kickstarter campaign, and then we had the seed round basically about slightly more than a year ago, and you know, just recently, as you mentioned, we've completed our Series A financing of $15 million, led by Jim Breyer. So, you know, we have private investors, we have institutional investor, and we have, you know, let's say kind of global leading startup investors like Jim Breyer that have supported us among other people. And you know, from here, obviously, with such a substantial financing for our stage of the business, we obviously hope to get to a place where we don't need any more equity money. It doesn't mean we're not going to be interested in raising more money, but you know, our hopes and plans are to, you know, build a sustainable cash flow positive business from the financing we've got so far. There are other forms of financing as well, which, you know, we've done in the past and will probably continue in the future. Like, you know, we have support from Barclays, one of the main high street banks in the UK, which supports us with working capital to build inventory. And that's obviously one of the areas that, you know, startups like ours, hardware startups, which, by the way, you didn't mention, so I'm just happy to mention it myself. Yesterday we won the best hardware startup in Europe in the Europas, so it's a pretty exciting
Congratulations.
Week.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you. Luckily,
I was. It's hard to keep up with it.
Yeah, you know, we're trying to enjoy really every small win we have as a company, and not just kind of these big trophies. But it's obviously nice. But you know, going back to the point, you know, financing is a job, and you know, Will mentioned it correctly. You know, out of the 2.5 years that we are alive as a company, you know, I personally spent over, you know, probably at the minimum over 6 months, if not more, of literally focusing only on financing efforts, meeting travels, and you know, the Series A financing was really kind of the peak of our financing efforts to date because of the substantial amount. And you know, I've been traveling like crazy. So let's say the first 4 or 5 months of this year, I spent most of my time on that. So it takes a lot of time. It's a job. It's not something you do part-time, and that's why I totally, you know, plus one on Will's comment on raise as much as you. First of all, raise as much as you think you need, but obviously raise as much as you can. So if you think you need 10 million, but someone comes and tells you, or if you think you need 1 million, but someone comes and tells you take 2, then take the 2. Especially at the early stages, you don't want to find yourself, raising money and it's actually less than you thought you need for a runway of 18 months. Because otherwise, you're going to raise money and not for a year, and after 6 months, you'll find yourself also again raising money. And as I just mentioned clearly, it's going to take a lot of your time and resources. And financing at the end of the day, it's critical for the survival of the business. And one of the roles of the founders and the CEOs is to make sure the company have enough blood, and it means money in the bank. Having said that, at the end of the day, there's a business to build, there's a team to grow, and if there's one thing that is probably way more challenging and difficult than starting a company is actually to run a company, and that means hiring people, growing the people. It becomes all about the people once you actually launch something, and this is where you need to spend your time as a founder. So I think also people need to think, the audience, in my view, need to think not just only about what's an exciting idea and am I passionate about it. To me, that's like the given, the obvious thing to do, which if you don't have that, don't even consider starting something. But then once it's clear to you, like totally flip the coin and really see the bigger picture, which is you're going to spend a lot of time in, selling to investors to invest in your company, unless you have brilliant mind like Rachel to manage to do some quick wins on Bitcoin, which I think is actually brilliant. So well done. And most importantly, you're going to spend a ton of your time talking to people, recruiting people, selling your vision to people who you want to join you. And then once they join, this is where it actually really starts. You have to manage them, you have to motivate, you have to give them clarity, you have to make them happy, you have to inspire them, because they're going to need to do that as well when they hire people. And this is probably one of the hardest, if not the hardest things I've done so far in my life, and it will continue to be so now that we are kind of crossing the 40 people team, which is a big, big challenge.
Yeah, that's the really great clarification point, Jonathan. So it seems that as we're really happy to be supporting entrepreneurship here at EPFL and to be promoting the idea that we have what it takes, all of us, we can learn what it takes to start a company, and we want to promote people to not be scared and take that leap. But at the same time, while promoting entrepreneurship, there's a danger in promoting what Max Marmer wrote in HBR called celebrity entrepreneurship, or mistaking winning pitching competitions, for example, as success, or equating fundraising as success. As you mentioned, it's just the first part of the challenge, and actually a lot of startups, few, but a lot of startups manage to make it just through bootstrapping and organic growth and don't actually need outside fundraising. So this brings me to one of the questions. I'd like to start bringing in some questions now from the students. This is from Nadua, who sent in her question from Abidjan. So the question is, when are you ready to raise money? Is there a checklist? So Will, you mentioned that in your portfolio, sometimes they only had a prototype. And Jonathan, you also mentioned that you were building these prototypes and then you were funded. I'm not sure about the exact order, but you had angel investment, then seed investment, and you were building the prototypes in the meanwhile. Rachel, do you want to start? When did you think you were ready to raise money, and what kind of advice do you want to give students?
Sure. Well, again, I was intent on survival, so that was what kind of dictated my timing. But I actually got a really great piece of advice from Jeff Siebert, who was a co-founder of Crashlytics, which was acquired by Twitter in 2012. And he spoke at an accelerator that we went through last year, and he said that he would classify investors in two ways. There are vision-driven investors and then momentum-driven investors. Angel investors and sort of smaller size checks that would typically fall under the vision umbrella. And he said that he thought that a lot of startups make the mistake of thinking that they should raise when they launch a prototype. And he actually advised either raising before the launch of the prototype. So the thinking there was that you could launch a prototype and something inevitably is going to go wrong, something's not going to work, and you're going to be scrambling to kind of fix that. And when you do that, you're not pitching a vision anymore, because there's actually this technology that exists in reality. And you can pitch a vision and make it sound sort of like much more grand in the beginning. And then you can only raise from momentum investors once the prototype is working and you have like a clear product market fit and you're growing. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that like what worked for me was pitching vision investors. So when we had some traction, I would share that, but I would really try to get investors excited about kind of like the mission behind what we're doing. We're interested in transforming the definition of gaming so that it incorporates social good. And because that was the mission, I was able to find vision-focused investors, angel investors, who just were really into that idea. And the other great thing about angel investors is that they write checks quickly. They tend to write checks quickly. So I could go in and just get someone excited about what we were trying to do, and they would write a check. This happens, I don't know, 1 out of every 40 meetings or something is probably what my track record was. But yeah, so I think kind of like the conventional wisdom that trying to raise when you have a prototype might not necessarily be the best way to go for every startup.
So let me rephrase that. I think within this question, when are you ready to raise money, there's also the big question of who can you raise money from. So it sounds like with angel investors, especially if you have contact to angel investors, it's not easy. As you said, 1 out of 40 investors you talk to will say yes. I think that's important to say. I mean, that sounds like actually a really optimistic number to me. I think it's important to say, like, don't be discouraged and keep going and keep pitching, because it does sound that you have a great vision. So you were saying that your startup helps to incorporate social good into a game. So you might have any type of online game that's very popular, but doesn't have any social explicitly social component to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you do is you create this plugin that allows gamers to buy something that then translates into some action in real life. It could also be something like planting a tree or something. Maybe you plant a tree in the game, and then it also equates to planting a tree in real life. But in your case, you're providing microfinance loans in developing countries.
Right. And I would just quickly add, because I think this might be helpful for those people listening who are in emerging markets as well. AngelList, angel.co, has been a fantastic resource for us, and it allows you to access investors all around the world. I've been able to close somewhere between probably around $150,000 from investors through AngelList that I've never actually met in person. And I'd be happy to talk more about the technique I used in order to close those investors. I could do that offline if anyone wants to reach out to me directly. But that's a way that you can plug into investors in other startup hubs, even if you're in a geographical location where there isn't kind of like a strong startup ecosystem or a mature startup ecosystem just yet.
Thanks for that tip, Rachel. It's true that in a lot of places, including Europe, the angel investment space is not very well developed, and that resource to AngelList will be very helpful. And it actually leads into my next question. So, Will, could you tell us, how does someone typically get in touch with you, or how do you hear about a startup? And then could you also comment on when were cases when you knew that the startup should not be pitching you right now, that the startup was not ready?
So on the first one, I can answer pretty well, I think. We track where every deal that we see as a fund, we track exactly not just the details of the deal, but also where it came from and how we found it. And so we see roughly about 1,000 companies a year. Of those 1,000 companies, we invest in about 10 a year. So first of all, it's a pretty steep funnel for how many we see to how many we invest in. But of the 10 that we invested in, roughly or usually about 80% of those come through personal contacts. So, and yet at the same time, of the 1,000, about 40% of those come through cold calls. So what I'm basically saying is that we've never invested in a company that cold called us on LinkedIn or on Twitter or via email. But in reality, we invest in people who come through personal contacts. And the reason why is there's no question, the best way to get in touch with an investor is to go through someone he respects. Whether that's you choosing someone in our portfolio, someone we've invested in, and saying like, look, here's my tech, have a look at it. They look at it, and then they call me and say, look, you need to meet these other founders. It might be another investor. It could be someone who's an expert in a field. But the thing is that the best way to get an investor to meet with you, and the best chance you have of getting them to listen to you, is to go through a personal contact. and that's my view on it. It's definitely the way the numbers in our portfolio show it. And then on your second question, remind me your second question again, excuse me.
It was a question on, maybe I could phrase it in a more positive way. Could you provide maybe a few checklist items that a startup can use to see if they're ready to raise VC funding?
Yeah. So I think when you're raising money from a venture capital fund, you've got to realize you're taking on institutional capital, and with that, there are certain kind of financial things that need to be in order. So you need to have your accounts in order. You need to have accounts that actually you can show and produce. Most funds wouldn't be allowed to invest in a company that doesn't have regular accounts coming out. They have a fiduciary duty to their investors to make sure that that's happening. I think also, but apart from that, actually, in reality, the stage we invest in entrepreneurs, it's more about different funds act very differently. Some funds invest very late stage and write big checks, but there's quite a number of funds like us that really are able to invest very early on. So again, as I mentioned earlier, for us, we've invested in a team of 2 or 3 people who've just started the company with an idea and a vision. I think maybe the only thing that we wouldn't invest in is we don't invest in single founder companies. We think there's a huge power in having a team, but with the exception of that, I think for us, once they are a strong team and they have they're going after a market that we think is interesting, we're pretty happy to invest. And the point on accounts can be solved pretty quickly with an accountant.
Yeah, and that's also a really interesting point about teammates and building either a strong co-founder group or a team group, because it seems like one of the messages you're putting across is that you want to see entrepreneurs who have convinced a community around them, and then that somehow leads to you. So you are getting through your personal contacts a recommendation, and you're also getting a pseudo recommendation from co-founders, because if one co-founder is founding a company with someone else, it means that they both thought that the opportunity was strong enough. So let me flip it over to what should entrepreneurs be looking for in an investor. Rachel already talked about selling her vision and finding people who were interested in incorporating social good into gaming. And I understand that Jonathan also has some investors, especially the most recent round. I was looking up Jim Breyer's biography, and he says he's very interested in social entrepreneurship, and it seems like Kano is trying to bring a lot of education and fun to young children through technology. So, Jonathan, do you want to talk about how to find a fit with an investor? What should entrepreneurs be looking for?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, it's not. Someone told me, friendship. For friendship, you need shared values. For partnership, the mathematics need to work. And I think with investors, both need to work. You want someone who has shared values and a shared vision to what you're trying to build, and you also want them to be able to go, the whole way with you, and you want them to have deep pockets and be able to support you as the company grows, because it's a long journey. We've been lucky with investors that totally get the vision, and a comment about social entrepreneurship. I think every entrepreneurship is social by default. If it's not, then it's probably illegal. Every business that gets, i.e. Silk Road was not entrepreneurship. It was, right? But every entrepreneurial endeavor that gets people to wake up in the morning, you're trying to do good. Even if it's a CRM software as a service, you're trying to help salespeople do a better job and succeed. And if they do that, their company does do better. They hire more people. The salespeople themselves have more equity in their life to support their family, get their kids' education. I mean, every business by default is a social entrepreneurship. And if it's not, it's probably illegal. So I think with that in mind, it's really important just to find, the right incentives, both kind of social and economical, with investors. You want to be able to feel there's a click. I mean, anyone with a long-term relationship would say that, you don't know how it's going to look like. And, I'm saying this as someone who started a company with 2 people that I've known very, very briefly before we started, and one of them I knew for 12 hours before we started a company together. And it's an evolving relationship, and it's the same with investors. We now have over almost 15 individuals as investors throughout the journey, not to mention the 14,000 backers on Kickstarter. So I think at the end of the day, especially at the early stages where you're not raising $100 million from the Goldman Sachs of the world, you want to feel that there is a match. So spend time with investors, and spend time with investors when you don't need to raise money. I go back and just adding a point to the question around when is the right timing. When the time comes that you need to raise money, you better be ready with investors who are already opening their checkbook. Because when you need to raise money and then you go and raise money, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to raise money. Because most investors, and Will can answer on his behalf, most investors do not want to invest in people who actually need money. You want to come and start a conversation with Will and coming with a prototype telling him, hey, Will, a friend of mine told me, you're a great investor, and you're a great investor. And look, I'm not raising at the moment. I'd love to get your feedback on where we are as a product, where we are as a company, and really just anything you can help. Just would love your feedback. And you want to end up the meeting with Will saying, hey, I'd love to give you money, right? Instead of you saying, that's how much we're raising, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I know it might sound like, oh, this is a fairy tale, but actually, and that's a lot of the process we've done, and we've been lucky, and I've been personally lucky to get a lot of guidance on that, and starting conversation with investors when you don't need money, and just build a network, build the relationships. It's all about relationships. No one likes to be feeling like he's a checkbook, especially not investors. Spend time broadening the network. It's a job. And it's a job that is every day you build relationships, and it's not just with investors. It's in every single part of the business, in the way you build a team. You're not going to hire the right people when you need right people. You need to build these relationships ahead of the curve. And one of your roles as a founder is to all the time be one step ahead and knowing who are the right people you need to know. And it's a work around people, not around processes.
Yeah, I would second a lot of what Jonathan just said. And I think that what people, it's always very difficult to raise money, but if you can build that vision with that investor before you need that money, then you literally have created this bond between them and this common shared vision. And I can't emphasize that enough about meeting them beforehand. And I think in a perfect world, what you would look for is you would think about what are the biggest challenges you're going to face in the next 12 to 18 months. And say, who are those investors that can help me solve that? So that might be a VC, that could be an angel who's a specialist in a certain industry. They're trying to find those investors who are really, really suitable to helping you solve those challenges. And then the final thing I'd say, and this is something that I can't emphasize this enough to entrepreneurs, because I used to say this when we started the fund, because I did it when I was finding my investors. But it's amazing now, we've made almost 20 investments, and so few entrepreneurs ever ask for this. But it's when you're talking to investors, you should be doing due diligence on them as much as they do it on you. And you should talk to the people they've invested in before. Talk to people who they've invested in that companies have failed and the companies have succeeded, and see how they act, see how they work, see are they calling all the time? Are they never calling or never answering their phone? Just try to understand how an investor works, and then decide, does that work with the way that you like to work?
Thanks so much for all these points. So we have just over 15 minutes left in the call. Thanks to everyone who's joining in and sticking with us. I'd like to just recap a bit what we've been saying. We've had some great points on investor management, on managing your social network, and how to speak to investors. There's also some great stuff on finding a fit, doing due diligence on the investors themselves, finding out whether they can offer something very interesting to your venture, whether it is their network or their expertise. We talk about this a lot in week 4, about the need to find smart money and take smart money. Since we only have 15 minutes left, I'd like to touch on some other points that were raised. So perhaps we could talk briefly about crowdfunding, and then maybe go into some other practical aspects of raising money. So, Jonathan, since you are the one on the panel here who has had experience with crowdfunding, can you talk about how it's been different raising money from the crowd and raising money from investors? And then could you comment on this experiment with allowing communities to back Kano? and gain equity. So this is the highlighting aspect.
Yeah. So it's two separate use cases. On the Kickstarter front, I see it less as raising money from the crowd. I see it more as bringing people from the community into the vision of what we're trying to create, and making them feel like this is something that they would either, one, would love to see coming to life, or this is something that they would like to see coming to life, plus they would love to use or give it to someone. And I think Kickstarter have been phenomenal in that, providing that kind of platform, to tap into an incredible network of several million people in one place. Having said that, it requires a lot of things to work well in order to be really, really successful on Kickstarter. And not surprisingly, out of more than 500,000 projects, campaigns launched on Kickstarter in the past 5 years, still only about 100 have crossed the $1 million of funding. And we're totally thrilled to be one of those 100. And the reason is because people are going to spend money, and you need to convince them why this is interesting and why what you're doing is unique, and why on earth would they give money to you, whom they never met before, to do something you've never done before, and hopefully deliver on their promise, especially with many Kickstarter campaigns kind of not being successfully fulfilled. So that has been very, very challenging, and I think it's it's almost like a separate session, which obviously I'm happy to share more about that, and if people feel like they're gonna reach out directly, then easiest way is probably either WeChat or WhatsApp. On the other side, on something that is still going live from our side, which is Choir. So we've used Choir online to allocate $500,000 of our $15 million Series A round, and we've allocated that $500,000 only to the people from our community. And from our community, it means people who have actually bought the Kano computer. So it's not open to the public. It's only open for people who are within the Kano community today, and we've invited them to become small shareholders in the company, and the result is kind of a partnership between us and Choir, who are, let's say, they play the role of the Kickstarter here. They do the platform, they run and manage the campaign, and we've basically kind of reached out directly to our community. And for us as a company, this has really been part of the core principles of our company from the beginning, of bringing people into our vision, bringing people into our journey, and not just investors. And I think one of the things that kind of is being manifested because of that mission that we take is also the fact that we've incorporated our own foundation during this series.
We're losing you, Jonathan.
So
we just lost the last sentence.
So I was just saying that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, so I was just saying that we've also, as part of that kind of social element of bringing the community in, we've also incorporated recently our own foundation, which is called Kano Academy, and we've kind of benchmarked it on the model of Salesforce Foundation. So it's 1-1-1 model. So we've allocated an undiluted 1% of the company shares to our foundation. So the foundation will always have 1% of the company shares, also 1% of employee time, and 1% of our units sold a year we are donating to people around the world who either cannot afford themselves Kano, or trying to empower young entrepreneurs globally. So the Kickstarter and the Choir, it's all kind of part of a broader mission that we take of being a truly socially motivated company, and doing that from day one, and not necessarily after we become publicly traded or something like that.
So that's fascinating, and it's interesting to see you use crowdfunding as a tool. Let me try and throw in some other questions. So Rachel or Will, you could maybe pitch into this question from Lucas from LA. So Lucas says, apart from the fundamental questions surrounding the venture, such as the break-even point, profitability, the burn rate, what other questions can we expect from a potential investor? So Rachel, do you want to talk about maybe some surprising or tough questions that you received, or maybe even tough experiences that you had while fundraising? And Will, you already answered some of these. Maybe you could highlight the ones that you think are a bit unique, such as the fact that you only invest in co-founded teams or co-founded ventures rather than single founder ventures?
Well, do you want to start? I'm going to have to think about this for a second.
Yeah, so I think on the specific things that an investor might ask, it really varies depending on what type of company you have. So, if you're a consumer company, I might start asking, let's say a consumer e-commerce company, I might start asking about how you do your shipping, logistics, where you store your stock. I might ask things like, what's your cost of customer acquisition? What methods of marketing you're using? That's kind of your consumer e-commerce company. Then if you're a B2B enterprise databasing company, I might talk about how long it takes you to get a customer, to get to a meeting with a customer. I might talk about what's your sales processes. I might talk about the actual much more in depth on the technology, because that would be much more important in a databasing startup than it will be necessarily in an e-commerce, an online e-commerce play. So it's just more. It's a very hard to answer question unless you know specifically what the startup is. That would be kind of my view on it. If you're a mobile app, maybe it's about how much users and the growth in users or the activity of the users. So it really depends on the company. So it's hard for me to answer specifically.
That actually is quite useful. So you're already giving some guidelines depending on what type of company someone is. And what I'm hearing as well is that, Will, you're looking at B2B, B2C ventures and in the software space. So it's also worth checking out a VC's background, as you mentioned before, finding what types of things they like to invest in and being prepared for those kinds of questions. Rachel, maybe I can clarify the previous question that I sent you with or complement it somehow. This is a question on soft skills required to convince investors.
Yeah, that's great. That's actually just the direction I thought that I would take my answer before you clarified that. What I didn't understand initially, and I think this is very practical advice, even though it's sort of more abstract, is that raising investment is very much about psychology. So there's kind of this underlying thing, and Will, please feel free to chime in coming from the other side, but if an investor, it's supply and demand. So if when you're desperate for money and no one is in, it looks like the demand for what you're offering, essentially equity in your company, is lower. So an investor is going to be less likely to want to jump in on that. But whenever you're raising a round and you've set a certain amount and you're close to closing that full amount, then there's only a small amount of allocation that you still have left. So an investor sees that there's a higher demand and a limited supply, so they're more likely to pull the trigger more quickly. So once I came to understand that, I was able to kind of position our raise in such a way that I was letting investors know, like, hey, we only have this amount of allocation left at this specific valuation cap. We're going to close on X date. Usually I would try to say, set things up so that we were raising the cap, within a 2-week period, so there was a sense of urgency. And that way I was able to get either a quicker yes or a quicker no. And another thing I didn't understand initially was that a quick no is the second best answer. Sort of the worst thing that can happen, in my opinion, when you're raising money is when an investor kind of, and this happens more when you're sort of a more naive entrepreneur, when you're less experienced, when an investor kind of drags their feet and doesn't give you a yes or a no, and you're still kind of holding out hope that they're going to come in.
Slow no.
Right, it's the worst. What you want to do is you want to know yes or no as quickly as possible, so that way if someone says no, you can start refocusing your energy on other investors who may be more likely to give you that quick yes. So and the other thing about that though is that the slow no it's an answer in and of itself. If someone is dragging their feet, it's important to realize that no is probably the answer. They just, for whatever reason, haven't sort of like blatantly told you that. So just
that's
kind of
really helpful, Rachel.
Yeah, just those mechanics are important to understand. It really is all psychology, I think, on a certain level.
So those soft skills are really important when it comes to raising money, and I like how you created or underlined the sense of urgency, saying that within 2 weeks I need to raise this money. And perhaps something else that's interesting is maybe using the amount of equity that is available also as as a way to say this is a very rare and unique opportunity. So I have to ask this question, which has been raised by many students. So what is the maximum percentage of your share that you should let an investor acquire?
I think you should let the investors have everything. Maybe not. I'm joking. From my perspective, I think that there are lots of different types of investors, and different investors can add very different things. I think, you know, before you decide to raise money, the founders should have an idea of what they're willing to give away. So this is on one side. The founders should be willing to understand what they're willing to give away and what they're not. And so that way they can rule out any options or offers that are not within that range. I think in reality, what often happens is that a lot of investors are looking for roughly between 15 to 25% of the company in any round. And so I think as a founder, in the tech world at least anyway, that's really where you should be willing to give up. I know in other industries like in food, I know you usually have to give away a lot more because it's a different type of company with a different potential exit. But in the tech world, you usually should be willing to give away between 15 and 25%. I don't know whether you guys have experienced different things, but that's my view of it.
Well, what's also interesting is in our conversation when I asked Jonathan about his future plans for fundraising, he mentioned that he also wanted to, by the next time, in the short to medium term, transform Kano into a profitable company which wouldn't need external financing. So that's also, I guess, an answer in itself that you should limit the amount of equity that you're giving up. Jonathan, do you also want to pitch in? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a good question to, for people to actually to ask. I agree, and I tend to echo Will's comment, but I would add that at the end of the day, what's most important when you raise the money is not if you're on 15, if you give 15 or 25. For the right investor, go the extra mile to make them happy. The right investor would also want you to be happy. So you need to remember that. And if you don't feel the right investors, try and make you happy as well as him being happy, then fit. But at the end of the day, you want to have the right investors, and in some cases, not in all cases, in some cases, the right investors would want more because they are very clear with what's their added value and how they can support your growth. Especially kind of the top tier investors. And it's a game that it's part of the raising. It's a game, and the game of the valuation and the game of the percentage. It's a game, and as long as the company is an early stage, which basically means the first several years of the company's life, you need to be able to play that game and remember that the equity is very, very important, but you need, at the end of the day, you want to be with 10% of a company worth $1 billion rather than 30% of a company valued at $10 million. So
right.
The mathematics are clear.
Could
so that's a really good.
Add one extra thing? Sorry, just quite a quick thing. I think just on top of Jonathan, what he's saying there, because you're talking about negotiating and kind of debating these kind of things. One of the biggest mistakes I see entrepreneurs make when you get to kind of the term sheet stage, when you're debating back and forth, what is the valuation, should the terms be, is that people focus on positions rather than interests. So they focus on this idea that, I want a valuation of X, or I won't accept vesting, or term Y or term Z, instead of thinking, actually, what am I trying to do here? What is the investor trying to do? Why do they want this term? Why do I not want this term? And actually having an open discussion about it. People get very focused on the position and not the interest. And at the end of the day, if someone's talking to you about a term sheet, it means that both of you want to invest. One of you wants the investment and one of you wants to invest. And it's just about getting there and trying to understand why is one person using these terms and another person not wanting them. I think if you get out the idea of positions and focus on what are the interests and why do people care about certain points, it moves through negotiations much faster and allows you to get your investment from the investor you want faster as well.
Right, so those are really great points. We're running out of time here, so I just want to sum up. I think what Jonathan was saying was really interesting. I could even take it to a larger extreme. Owning 100% of a company that's worth nothing is still owning nothing, right? And so if you want to get your venture off the ground, and then if you want to eventually later expand it and scale your company, there are going to have to be some negotiations. You're going to have to give up some equity. And what's important in those cases is to find someone that has a strong vision match. And then Will's point was once you get to the negotiating table, once a term sheet is presented, that means that both parties want to
work together.
work together. Exactly. Thanks, Will. And so the point is to try and make that go as smoothly as possible. In closing, I'd like to ask one last question to all the panelists. This is from Alfred, who's in Accra, Ghana, and his question is, did people tell you that your venture was too risky and that you should think of something less risky? So, Jonathan, maybe you can start.
You know, if someone told you your startup idea is too risky or too crazy, like you're probably onto something.
If people don't think you're,
I mean, otherwise, what are you going to start? Yeah, I mean, you want to be in a place where people tell you, like, look, I'll give us as an example. When we started the company, one of the main sentences we received from people in general was like, why are you starting a new type of computer company? There's like, the world is full of computers. And we're like, yeah, but it's not the right computer for the generation we're trying to empower, right? So, people with an idea that people might think either is crazy, either is irrelevant, or too risky, at the end of the day, you need to prove to yourself and to the rest of the world that you have something that you believe can happen. And if you're passionate about it, try and do it, because at the end of the day, what makes me wake up in the morning is passion to make something that a lot of people would want, and it maybe start with a niche audience, but it can grow to a global force of people who demand what you're building. And you want to wake up in the morning for something like that, rather than, and I'm not diminishing other startup ideas, but I think you're either the type of person who can go into an existing market and try and change it, or you're the type of entrepreneur who want to create something completely new, which is probably also very risky, but with great risk come great rewards. And if you succeed, then fine. If not, then you failed, and try again.
That's wonderful, Jonathan. So you're saying go for these risky ideas. Will, do you want to comment? Because another term for venture capital is risk capital. And I understand venture capitalists, they want to take a large stake in an idea, because if then it works out, then they will also get a payout.
Well, I think venture capital is a very risky model. I think historically, if you look at portfolios of venture capitalists in the US and Europe, you have roughly of every 10 companies they invest in, 6 will lose all of the money that they invest in. If you look at other areas of investing, whether it's private equity, hedge funds, pension funds, mutual funds, realistically, that level of risk is nowhere comparable to them. And so, the people who invest in us, who are banks, family offices, pension funds, they only allocate a very small amount of their money to a venture capital fund because what we do is so risky. But as Jonathan rightly pointed out, without taking that risk, you don't have those rewards. And venture capital, with a very small amount of capital, can return quite a lot to our investors as well. And I would very much second what Jonathan pointed out about, it's crazy. If people don't think you're a little bit crazy about what you're doing, it's probably too obvious an idea, and there's probably already 100 other people doing it.
Right. So entrepreneurs should go for these risky ideas and also seek money from people who are also interested in taking these risks. So, for example, in debt financing, Jonathan, you mentioned that with Barclays you have some help with your from them to deal with your inventory, but you're not going to be able to get a large amount of money from a bank at the same rate as you can get from a venture capitalist. Rachel, do you want to add some closing words on maybe something that someone told you about your venture that it was too risky or something else?
Sure. As you guys were talking, in our case, we're kind of sort of leveraging two problems against one another that seem very disparate. One problem is lack of capital access for micro-entrepreneurs in the developing world, particularly for women. And the other problem is totally separate. It's that freemium mobile games are really inefficiently monetized, and only 6% of users ever spend any money in a game. So we can help the game monetize more effectively. So I think it seemed crazy to people that we were trying to kind of combine those two things. And in the beginning, whenever I was kind of figuring out what my pitch needed to be, I was often asked, like, well, why don't you just be a microfinance company? Or why don't you focus on one side or the other? Why are you trying to be two businesses? And I would try and respond and say, like, no, we're not two businesses. We're kind of leveraging these two things against one another to create this single elegant solution that solves both problems in what's actually a pretty simple way. And as you guys were talking, I thought of something I read recently on Quora. It was somebody talking about meeting, the co-founders of Google in the late 90s and thinking like, oh, great, it's another search engine or something. And then like even sort of like my understanding of the development of the internet in the early 90s, like people were just using computers for word processing. So it seemed like nuts. Like, why would you want to connect computers to one another through like an information superhighway? Like, did you want to do that because that way I could do word processing on your device, like remotely? Like, why would you do that? So, I mean, so the point, I guess, is that ideas that can turn out to be really great and that are really kind of showing a lot of foresight can often seem super, not only crazy or risky at the beginning, but they might also just look like bad ideas. They might not make sense. So the point is like know your users yourself, and if you see that there's a clear demand for what you're providing, don't listen to those people that don't understand your market in the same way and don't understand the users. You can see for yourself.
That's amazing. So it seems like the job of the entrepreneur is to really understand the vision and the purpose of their venture and sell that vision and do it well. It's the job of the entrepreneur to convince investors that this is an up-and-coming vision that's worth investing in. So I would like to thank now all of our panelists, and thanks to all the viewers who are watching. The panelists have been really open in being available for further advice and feedback. I'm going to invite the panelists to our Facebook group for our course, and you can also contact them on Twitter. Jonathan mentioned that the best way to get in touch with him is WhatsApp and WeChat, so I'm going to take a note of that right now. So thanks again to all our panelists, Rachel, Will, and Jonathan, for spending an hour with our students. This video will be uploaded online to Coursera and translated so that our French viewers can also take a look.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys.
Everyone for
Thank
listening.
you.
It's a lot
Have
of
a
fun.
great afternoon and good evening to some.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.